Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. Sometimes the conversation about drug pricing within the pharma industry and the one going on in the wider world seem like they're in completely different languages. But as pharma learned in a big way last year, the political conversation around drug pricing can have a very real effect on their bottom lines and ways of doing business. Everyone says they want more affordable drugs for the patients that need them, but people disagree quite a bit on who's to blame for the current status quo of sky-high prescription prices and how they might be corrected. My guest today is Brandon Newman, CEO of healthcare analytics firm Xevant. Brandon is going to help me unpack the drug pricing conversation that's currently ongoing in the United States legislature and what pharma needs to know about the state of politics in the drug pricing debate. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, Jonah. Great to connect with you on a wonderful podcast, and hope to provide some value for you today.
Thank you. Before we get too far into it, tell me a little bit about yourself and about Xevant. Where comes your expertise in this topic?
Fantastic question. I come from a long line of being deep into pharmacy benefits. Got my start way back in the early 90s at another pharmacy benefits manager called RX America. Evolved over time, started my first enterprise in 2000, and that continues to thrive. This is my 10th venture at Xevant. All of them have been iterative in the path of finding ways to reduce the cost of pharmacy benefits, specifically drug costs. So 30 years really focusing on how we can reduce the cost of medication. It's multifaceted and very systemic, as we've seen of late. But what Xevant does, and our core and only focus, is to find the lowest healthcare net cost by way of reducing the cost of medication. And Xevant does that through technology, automation, and a number of really cool things that we all call AI, but we put that all in motion so that we can look at every prescription and find a way to reduce the cost for each, usually yielding around 25% reduction.
And when you say a way to reduce the cost, do you mean a way that a patient can reduce the cost right now, or do you mean like a way to fix the system to reduce those costs?
Those are great questions, and the broader macro look is that the tools and solutions that we present are finding their way into the macro systemic approaches. However, we're looking at immediate ways that as prescriptions are hitting the system, our system is analyzing those, looking for dozens of different ways to apply savings opportunities, changes in utilization, or just any which way in order to reduce the cost of the medication. And so it's both, but more often than not, it's on the reality of patients getting medications today.
So, and this is always a tricky topic to get into because I think a simple question like, how did we get here could be 3 podcasts worth of discussion. But, how do you kind of briefly summarize some of the current factors that lead to the drug pricing problem we have today in the United States?
That is the most loaded question I have heard in truly decades. But it's the question everybody should be asking. So congratulations for asking the question. And in reality, you got to go back decades upon decades to look at what we did to implement pharmacy benefits, where, way back when unions organized around and said, hey, let's help pay for the benefit. And then that evolved into, we've got medications. And back in the day, they were $5. Before we knew it, those $5 medications turned into $50, then they turned into $500, then they turned into $5,000, and now $50,000, now $500,000, and the latest, well over $2 million for a single medication therapy. It's just, really what's happened is, and it's not all bad, but what's happened is that we've seen the ability for a medication to dramatically change the curve of healthcare such that the total cost of healthcare can be reduced if you put it into either an outpatient setting or medication when it's also outpatient setting, and reduce the cost of healthcare, even though the cost of the medication on average continues to go up. And so, as we heard in the Senate hearings, over and over and over again, the net cost of medications is real. And I don't think that we look at it with the kind of microscope that we need to look at it with. But, medications that are coming out like biologics, they're curing diseases. And, what does that do to the healthcare system? If you're not looking at the overall, you're just looking like a microscope in a silo and say, hey, we've got a drug cost that increased in cost, or the average in that category increased dramatically, but we don't take into account the lens of the 10x reduction on hospitalizations, ER visits, lack of productivity, et cetera, then it really isn't a full story. And so I'm trying to share both sides of this coin. I do think that we're in a system that is broken. And we need to find a way to be cooperative together with the full system and the full chain of stakeholders, from pharma to wholesalers to pharmacies to PBMs to payers to employers, and ultimately the patients, who are the number 2 payer in the United States today, yet we don't have a voice. And so if we can collaborate together and solve this side of the issue without forgetting that we are reducing the overall net cost of healthcare by going to pharmacy or pharmaceutical approaches, then I think we're beginning to scratch the surface to answer your question. Sorry, it's a very long-winded response. And probably not an answer, but it describes the pathway to the answer.
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. What is so interesting to me, what I sort of alluded to in my intro here, working as a B2B journalist in pharma, I hear both sides. The pharma, argument is often like, hey, we're running a business and it's not a cheap business to run. We've got to do R&D. We've got to do manufacturing. We've got to meet all of these standards that the FDA and other regulatory bodies put on us. And those have a lot of cost baked in. And plus, where you're paying for not just the drug that worked, but the 3 drugs that didn't beforehand, that had all those costs baked in. And the other side is saying, all that, be that as it may, like, let's look at your record profits. Let's look at, plus, patients just can't afford these drugs oftentimes. One thing I have seen people sort of sometimes agree on is blaming some kind of middleman, and often that's the PBMs. That's one thing where pharma will say, yeah, look there. And so if that's the problem and people can agree on it, why hasn't it been fixed? And if that's not the problem, then, why not? What's the deal with the kind of the middlemen and the PBMs and everything?
Okay, great. So that's a space that I grew up in, and so I get a side of having grown up in that industry, while also applying a lens of trying to reform, by way of a cooperative approach. And so if you suggest that we should just eliminate the middleman, just go get your medication from pharma, everything's going to be okay. That's similar to Robin Hood saying, hey, it's all okay, move on your merry way. The taxes are just going to be fine. Ultimately, PCMA has done a phenomenal job over many years documenting the benefits of a pharmacy benefits manager, if done right. And there is a caveat, an asterisk there, which I'll hit on here in a second, but it is proven that PBMs have done a phenomenal job to bring down the cost of medication by way of drug utilization review, managing the overall cost, applying rebate management. And if you look at the graphs and charts and all that, it's not an insubstantial, insignificant amount of money that they save, and they only take on the net 2%. So you could say, hey, they're big, bad, they're just taking money off the top. But the proven fact is they're actually reducing the overall cost. So you could say, hey, let's eliminate them, but you're still going to have to address what they do somewhere else. And we haven't found a solution for that. So now let's go to the other side of reform or incentives to help everybody play according to the big T word, transparency, and say, I'm okay if you decide to go implement drug cost reduction measures through a PBM, but you have to do it with more transparency. You can't apply a formulary with rebates that drive up the cost of medication in order to pad your pockets. And that's a little salacious, and I'm not a big fan of making that soundbite, but it is out there. It's in the cracks and crevices of the industry. But largely, we've been through this for decades, and most good PBMs understand how to produce the lowest net cost. And outside of trust us, we're doing it. Now we're saying, well, we believe you, but now just prove it. And so the proof of verifying that they are doing what they need to do is key. And once we get to that full transparency and we really start providing insight on how a drug is priced, how a drug is managed, what programs are being applied to reduce the cost, can I, the patient, and my kids, when I go to the pharmacy, look at that medication and know what rebate was reduced to drive the lowest net cost, and I pick the drug that truly does drive down the lowest net cost. When we get there, we're beginning to scratch a deeper surface on solving those problems. But it requires not just transparency and even legislation, but an entire industry to just simply say, I will prove that I am doing, things out in the open and telling you what I'm doing.
Yeah, and transparency is a hard one for the pharma companies because they're, of course, all competing with each other. And there are certain things you don't want to be transparent about when your competitor is watching. And that might be related to your R&D costs or things like that. So what kind of transparency are we talking about, and how can we encourage a sort of transparency that isn't going to be detrimental?
Yeah, I think the three core areas of transparency that legislation is looking specifically on PBMs, and I'll speak on that one. Pharma, I have a whole nother category that we can hit on, but the PBMs, they're looking at spread-based pricing, or how you bill the client and pay the pharmacy. If they are different, you need to disclose that you are taking that. There's been measures, or at least desires by the industry to abolish spread-based pricing. I don't necessarily agree with that. I simply believe that the best way is to describe, I'm making money between what I charge and what I pay, and here is the amount. And that's part of my incentive to go drive down costs. We have actually seen that work tremendously, but when you're not transparent and say, hey, this is where I'm making money, that's when it kind of gets rampant. Other two areas are around DIR fees and how pharmacies are reimbursed, not knowing exactly when they dispense a medication, if they're going to make money or lose money is a really inherent problem, and PBMs have a way to manage and mitigate that. And the last one is around rebates, and there's been a whole lot of discussion. We've seen the market as a whole start to shift to much more a transparent look, but there is very little view into what pharma pays down to a GPO, down to an aggregator, down to a PBM, down to a health plan, down to the employer, down to the patient, that where does that money actually flow through, that, it's really tough to understand. The money that's available that pharma has provided, is it actually getting to the end payer who can make a decision on the right drug at the right place at the right time?
Well, let's get into the pharma side.
So there's been an interesting scenario where the Inflation Reduction Act, where the government has decided we can set prices on certain medications, and that action alone helps the government in Medicare, Medicaid, and what we're trying to do as it relates to members who operate within that environment. What we've seen is, however, when that pricing is controlled, it's like a tube of toothpaste. And what pharma has done is they've increased prices elsewhere to make up for and to ensure they get their profits. So in my opinion, it's one of two things. It's not necessarily that pharma is like, listen, I can make this drug at a lower price and I'm just being mean-spirited and charging a ton of money. They're saying, I got to make my profit somewhere, and I'm going to move that toothpaste over here to pay for it. But who hurts? It's the commercial markets. It's most of us, the 60% of us who operate within an employer or an organization that is paying for the medication. All of a sudden, those prices increase to make up for the cost reduction that happened through the negotiation on the Inflation Reduction Act. And so that is one of those concerns. The other one is, can they be more efficient? Could they look at rebate programs, specialty copay programs, patient assistance programs, and make them a little easier to get to, why offer them? Why not just give the lowest net? And there is a whole discussion about why do we even need rebates? I think that I could be swayed either way, for or against, but since the early 90s, that's been the program that's been in place that is the most effective and doesn't have any antitrust issues. In order to apply discounts by way of demonstrating movement of utilization of medication. It's a long topic that we can get into, but the rebate, it works, but I think that there's inherent flaws in how manufacturer assistance by way of rebates or copay assistance has been deployed. And I think the middleman, once they could be more transparent about it, we could actually see those dollars being benefited. And I think the one key difference, and I'll end on this, is as soon as we can start seeing data in real time where patients can actually see the benefit of a rebate or copay assistance when they go get their medication, not sometime after or as negotiated by the PBM. When we see that, I think we'll actually see the benefit of the full benefit of the rebate.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of information asymmetry where people don't actually know how expensive their drugs are because of the way.
Right.
You mentioned the IRA, and I wanted to get into the government side of this a little more. So the government, and we'll start with the U.S. government, and I want to take the global perspective after this, but we'll put that on a shelf for a minute. They have a few different levers they can pull to try to impact drug prices and transparency. And with the IRA, obviously, cost, either negotiation or cost setting, depending on whose terminology you want to use for a small handful of drugs, is one lever. But also that kind of exclusivity period, that period of time before those cost measures kick in, this notion that, we can allow generics to come on the market faster, and that will lower prices through natural market selection forces. Are there other things the government is talking about doing or could be doing that they're not? How do you see kind of their proper role to play here?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to what I ended on the last topic, and the programs are available, and let's just describe them. Branded generic, brand medication to generic. I didn't mean to say branded generic. That's a whole, subset of contract sort of nuance that I don't want to get into, but shifting from branded generic has been the age-old way to reduce the cost of medication. But there's a new way, right, that says specialty medication, let's say that specialty medication on an annual basis is $180,000, but the biologic associated with it, and we saw this, in a number of categories this past year, the biologic or the biosimilar, that biosimilar is very similar to the branded generic. And so even though specialty drugs only account for 1%, 2%, 3% of overall utilization, they are now accounting for 60% of the cost. So even though it's just a tiny little sliver, if you can move that tiny little sliver by 20, 30, 40% into a biosimilar that has a 30, 40, 50, even 70, 80% cost reduction, then you're now getting the benefit of that brand to generic shift, but you're doing by way of what's happening now by way of specialty drugs. And nearly all medications that are coming out are now specialty because pharma has figured out that's a much higher yield. And even though I'm only getting 0.5% of the population, I can sustain my revenues, sustain my growth by releasing biologic medications that are infused or injected, similar medications, and actually, largely take a hit on the healthcare side, get people out of the hospital, get people out of the ER, get them more productive, potentially solve and cure diseases. It very well is the new frontier of pharma. So you look at that as an inherent cost increase, although it reduces the cost of healthcare. Then if you introduce biosimilars, which is like generics, then you further reduce the cost. So yes, natural selection does happen. If we can embrace those things, the government and or commercial markets can truly leverage all the opportunities in front of them. And there's many, many others that are out there that we can talk through, but those are key. And where I've sort of ended on the last topic is if we could use data and technology and show what those programs can provide at the point of sale, then and only then are we truly able to take benefit of all the programs that we can get and actually get that instead of waiting for that prescription, do all the analysis for 6 months, and then say, hey, in the future, do this. That is just not really, it doesn't really bring down the cost of pharmacy benefits that quick.
Interesting. So you're saying that like right now, there's a lot of improvement that can be made just by better understanding how the existing interventions are working. And that data is there. It just needs to be collated, analyzed, and then utilized.
Offered at real time or point of sale real time, if that can be done, which we're part of that solution, then we can have all those programs when I show up and I could see what I can actually reduce my cost of my medication. It could be the Mark Cuban program. We saw that, right? It came out and that they're negotiating directly with pharma. Great. Let's make that available to the masses. There's rebate, there's biosimilars, there's generics, there's split pill, there's split fills. The list goes on and on and on and on. And even though PBMs are implementing a lot of those, many times they're implementing them 6 to 12 months after the fact. If you just put it at point of sale real time, you are going to let patients make that decision for you, and you empower the number 2 payer in the United States to make the right decision, which they've shown historically the ability to do right then and there, and it makes a big hit in healthcare.
You mentioned that specialty drugs make up a very small percentage of utilization, but a relatively high percentage of cost, and that made me think like this notion of the net cost to the system is a useful notion for pundits to discuss, but if you're a patient, finding out that the net cost has been reduced in a way that doesn't affect the cost of your daily life-saving medication, and that's, 80-90% of the population, like, is that a meaningful cost reduction? And is that a meaningful cost reduction if you're Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, I got a chance to listen to the Senate hearing, and I hate more than anything soundbite senators. And I don't mean to say I hate senators. I just hate the approach of using sound bites to get a point across. But there is some truth to it. If I have a disease, and probably cancer isn't the best example, but maybe rheumatoid arthritis is one of those. If I can make a big hit on it and stay out of the ER, stay out of the hospital, stay out of high cost healthcare, by taking a high cost medication, which by the way is 5 to 10 times cheaper than going down the route of, hospitals, ERs, low productivity, not showing up to work, those sorts of things, then yeah, the cost of healthcare is reduced. And I totally agree with Bernie on that front. But a cancer patient who lives or dies, and I don't want to make it that terrible of a notion, but lives or dies on whether or not they can afford the medication, those examples exist too. And just because they can't afford the medication, what's the net cost? Potential death. And is that really reducing the cost of of healthcare? That I don't really believe in. So there's two very polar ends of that spectrum that you have to play out. Somewhere in the middle, there's a lot of truth from both of them. When I say both of them, that soundbite of, hey, lowest net cost versus, the cancer patient who can't get their medication. There's a lot of cooperation that needs to be played out there. But I agree. I totally agree. The lowest healthcare net cost can be achieved, and it can be done by leveraging pharmaceuticals very well.
I said I wanted to get to the global perspective, and I know we're a little flexible on time, but we're coming towards the ending part. So I've heard it said that because other countries were quicker to move more dramatically on legislating pharmaceutical prices, there's a sense in which it feels like America is subsidizing the world's pharmaceutical innovations because the companies are able to charge more for their drugs here. And this is where they're getting a lot of the profits that they're using to develop new drugs. Now, Pharma will also quickly say that we have access to better cutting-edge drugs than the rest of the world as a result of that. But do you think that that's part of the problem here when it comes to the showdown between the U.S. government and the pharmaceutical industry is that we're almost sort of this last battleground for figuring this out? Or do you think the rest of the world maybe also has some bigger problems with this than maybe we necessarily acknowledge in our American debate about drug pricing?
As I've been very well, balancing this tightrope that you're putting me on, there's two sides of this story. Both I respect very well. I'll hit the easy one. Canada, Mexico, India, Japan, and how they're able to negotiate their pricing. The question and the I guess the answer that Pharma provided in the Senate hearings is straight up true. How they their systems work. Pharma can make a profit there, and they don't have to price it as high as they do in the United States. That being said, access to those medications and access to healthcare and timely access to those medications, waiting 6 months and so forth. It's a different system, and that's the key word I'm going to use is that the systems in other countries are not the same as those in the U.S. Very, very different. And I believe, and this is going to be a bit of a soundbite, but drug pricing in the U.S. is based on the system which was built to support and sustain it. So the whole process from just creating and distributing and dispensing and pricing and managing drugs in the U.S. is very unique. And because of this system, we have to price it fairly, in my opinion, high. Could you do something to the system to mimic some of those other countries? Yes. Would you potentially have access problems? Yes. And I think that that's kind of where we in the United States have said, listen, it is our right to go go down the street to a pharmacy. I won't use the name of any pharmacy, and get a medication and get it at a relatively low cost, i.e. a copay, go home, take it, and get better today. That's what we put a premium on. Unfortunately, other countries, they wait, they prior auth, or verify and do all these, get the programs in place so that when you do go to get that medication, all those programs have been applied. We just exchanged the need for drugs now versus the need for reducing the cost later. That is the major difference between what I see in the U.S. and what I see elsewhere. And it's something that in the U.S. we're constantly chasing, but months after the fact, and once someone starts on the therapy, getting them to switch is just nearly impossible. And I think as we learn from other countries and other systems where you can apply many of those programs, even in a real-time point-of-sale environment through technology, you could deliver a best of both worlds, the inherent benefits of other countries' systems in your own system by applying all those programs at that point of sale. Or we just wait and do it like everybody else does and get all those programs in place before you get the medication. I don't think the American people are willing to sacrifice the ability to have access to a drug today.
So tell me about this notion of the point of sale, getting all of the rebates and programs applied, what you guys do. What are the steps that need to be taken there? And for our listeners, whichever part of the ecosystem they're in, like, what do you wish people knew more about in terms of this data-based approach and this kind of currently existing, not solution, but, mitigation?
So every therapy, there are a set number of strategies to reduce the cost of that medication. I do have a slide I use often with folks that want to talk about the problem. And it says, hey, I have a green pill or I have an injectable. Which one's cheapest, right? You go at the pharmacy and it says, well, this one's priced, or I can actually price it. It says this one's priced at $1,000, this one's $850. I'll go with the $850. But as you go through every single strategy, program, rebate, 340B, split fill, discount, PBM discount, by the time you're done applying all those, the cost of those two medications has, and we have real proof of this, will change. Which one's better at minimum 12 times before you actually go out the door. So if you don't have access to the tools and programs and know what's out there, then you're just going to pick either the lowest copay or the one that you prefer. And that is the issue. And so knowing all of those for every single therapy, when a pharmacy runs them, the industry, and I'm including myself in this, has the responsibility that when you run that therapy at a pharmacy, we should be able to have access to every program, every strategy, every effort to reduce that cost in real time and apply that lowest net cost for the patient. And even better said, before the patient goes in, they should be able to do the same thing on their phone. That's my belief. here's my drug, here's all the programs, here's the lowest net cost. I pick, I go. Short of that, let's get the pharmacies and the industry doing it on their behalf in real time, which we can do today. So you have to take that commitment to doing that, breaking down the transparency issue, breaking down the issues or sort of the inherent gains that people can make out of the system. It doesn't always benefit the system to give the lowest net price. People make money in that, and they have to be willing to let go of a lot of that for the greater good, that the whole industry, or the whole process of prescriptions and pharmaceuticals survives. It truly is a little bit at that point of, if you don't make a change, you will start to see it break down.
It does feel like there's an issue here of incentives and, who is the actual decision maker, who's the payer, and who's, incentivized to make this decision, right? If I'm the patient, I'm only really concerned about the copay because that's the amount of money that I'm paying. Even when I'm the patient at the pharmacy, I might not actually be making a decision at all because the decision might have been made by my provider when they prescribed me the drug, and I'm just going to pick it up, right? And so, there's even a question of sort of who needs to have this information, and how do we make sure the information goes to someone who actually is incentivized to make the decision that reduces the cost to the system.
So the payer, and again, the payer can be both your employer, the health plan, the patient. I see a need for more collaboration there, but I'm going to give you an example. If I go get, my provider gives me a prescription for Lipitor, a nice easy one, or insulin, whatever it is, and I'm presented with, I go to the pharmacy here in the States, pick up my medication, I go to Canada. I go, you know what? Canada is going to get me 80% off. That's what Bernie has said, right? We heard him talk about on the Senate hearings. You can go across the border and go get the medication. The problem with that is I also paid not just my copay, but I already paid a premium to a health plan that was an employer-sponsored health plan. So when I go across the border, I basically take part of that premium and just torch it. Say, you know what? I paid into my system. I don't need it. I'm going to go across the border, get my medication lower. I don't really care that I paid, $800 per month or whatever it is. My employer paid $900 a month. I'm just going to go across and do it. That also creates a scenario where that medication, and that there's many of those situations, not just the Canada issue. When I go across the border, it doesn't show up in my system. So next time I go get a medication, it's not there. The PBM can't do its job that says, hey, you just took this insulin. Your doctor just gave me this new medication that counteracts. We don't want you to have an adverse event and end up in the hospital, which, by the way, contributes towards increased cost against the premium when you were supposed to be playing in the system. So at the end of the day, doing these things on my own doesn't always benefit. You have to take the macro look and look at the system that you paid into and see what the best good is. So you have to work within the payers. You, the employer, the health plan have to talk. We have to be able to negotiate together. We have to be collaborative in our ways to reduce the cost of medication.
All right, we should wrap this up. It's been a really interesting conversation, Brandon, and you've really helped to paint a lot of these things for me more clearly. Where do you see kind of some of the ways forward here? You've talked a little bit about what you guys do. Maybe on a systemic level, where should the industry be looking to kind of shore up some of these problems?
You always watch government, but ultimately this is one that not even government is going to fix. There's been a lot of bills, advanced in the House, and they don't look to be getting done. So then you go to the state level, and you get out of 50 states, you got 50 different versions of what's reality. Ultimately, those who are paying for the medication, again, health plans, employers, patients, getting the collaboration there, making sure that the aligned incentives are there. I think getting that bounded together is a big step in the right direction. And I'm going to say, what's the right word? A soundbite, if you will. If we don't, I can promise you that new technologies that are coming out will solve it for you. I see the advancements of AI dramatically changing the industry overnight, as I've already seen and will continue to see the advent of, ultimately, at the end of the day, we know how to fix this. We're just not willing to. And getting approaches by way of letting technology just go solve the problem. is coming about, and I think we're going to see more and more in that in the future. So, in fact, many companies have come out and introduced technologies that can actually solve many of these issues in a silo that will happen across the system at some point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. And we'll try to add a link if folks want to learn more about what you do. Yeah. Any other final thoughts?
It's been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate and applaud what you're trying to do, and hope the very best in your podcast. And best wishes to you this year.
Awesome. Thanks so much. That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.